Hi there, and welcome to the Guns Magazine podcast. I'm your host and the editor of Guns Magazine, Brent Wheat. We've got another great episode today. I'm talking to one of my favorites, Will Dabbs, MD. He's got some great stories that were told to him about the Tommy gun in World War II. And of course, then Will has to geek out about the design and where the Tommy gun came from and the history of it. So you'll get to see all that here in just a second. But first, we need to hear a word from our great sponsors. Introducing the 4 Patriots Solar Go Fridge, a revolutionary solar-powered fridge on wheels that can protect your food, drinks, and medicine during power outages. This is not an ordinary cooler. The Solar Go Fridge is a refrigerator, freezer, and deep freeze all in one. It can recharge for free in sunlight and even power your phone in a pinch. Plus, its portable design means you can take it with you anywhere, ensuring your essentials stay safe and cool while camping, fishing, and hunting. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com and use the code GUNMAG to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the amazing Solar Go Fridge. Don't let a power outage catch you off guard. Just go to 4patriots.com and use the code GUNMAG to get 10% off. Creedmoor Sports is your destination for all things precision shooting. Whether you're new to the sport, an experienced target shooter, or a die-hard competitive shooter, Creedmoor Sports has what you need to take your game to the next level. Visit creedmoorsports.com. Well, good morning, Will. Thanks for joining us from your, what is that, F-15, I think it is?
No, it's an FA-18. These are 18.
Hornets. Okay. Well, I've talked, you've been a guest on the podcast several times, and we use a video link. And I think the last time we had the audio-only podcast, I was kind of making the, I wish folks could see Will's cockpit set up in his video because he looks like he's flying in formation with a bunch of other F-18. So now that we are both video and audio, folks can actually see what it looks like. So I urge them to check out YouTube. But anyway, that aside, thank you for joining us. I think I'm looking forward to this because we were talking about something before we got started recording, the whole idea that everybody knows the Thompson Submachine Gun, the Chicago typewriter and all that. And back when we were growing up, there were all those comic books that had, Sergeant Kelly or Sergeant Gonad or whatever his name was. And, with the bada, 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 and all that. But truthfully, you don't hear a lot of actual stories of what it was like to carry a Thompson in combat. And you, Will, just happen to have had a friend that did just that. So I thought it would be pretty cool to talk about some of his reminiscence and your take on some of that, the Tommy gun in combat, something
Sure.
I get to hear a lot of. So, okay, you were saying it was a friend of yours. Kind of give me the background, set the stage here.
Sure. My day job, I work in a medical clinic, and that's the best place in my little town for meeting people. And tragically, all of our old World War II veterans are gone now. The last one that I knew of here in town that I was actually friends with died last week. But, one of the reasons the waits are sometimes not, or perhaps a little more protracted than they should be, is when I saw these old guys, I would usually take about 10 minutes and just say, all right, just tell me a war story. Mm-hmm. And, as a gun writer, that was always fodder for my gun articles, but it was a foot in the door to meet some of the most fascinating guys. And so in anticipation of this discussion, I sort of chewed over some of the cool Thompson discussions I've had with some of these old guys. And there are 3 guys who have given me observations about them. One gentleman was in Operation Torch in North Africa, Operation Husky in Sicily, and then fought all the way up Italy. So he was in and out of combat most of World War II in Europe, and he said he never saw a Thompson in an infantry unit.
Wow.
That M1s, M1 carbines, BARs, 1919s, all that. But he told me that he saw Thompsons, but he'd never seen Thompsons issued in an infantry unit. Likewise, there was another guy I met down south in southern Mississippi who had landed on D-Day and fought all the way across France. And he likewise said that he had never seen a Thompson in combat. But I met a gentleman in the clinic And this was his story. He landed in Normandy in September, October of 44. And, folks aged very quickly back then. So by early 1945, he was one of the old guys. And, they had suffered horrendous casualties. But towards the last 2 or 3 months of the war, he was one of the sort of old hands because they'd gotten so many replacements. And he said that late in 44, before the Ardennes offensive, before the Battle of the Bulge, he was called upon to do a night mission, a night patrol. He was issued an M1 Garand. And, those old guys, in general, at the time, they didn't call them Garands. There was only one M1. An M1 rifle was the 30-06 that we call the Garand. The M1 carbine was the carbine, and the M1 or M1A1 Thompson, they called the Thompson. So he had an M1 rifle, but was going on a night patrol and assigned to his unit, the Timberwolves, if I remember correctly. I forget the numerical designation. But they had a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, and along with the crew and the equipment to support it. And he said by 1945, that thing was totally worthless, that it was just superfluous. And against the kind of armor that the Germans were fielding, they understood that they just kept it in the rear. It was just baggage. But the crew to the 37 millimeter gun was issued Thompsons. And so before he went on this night patrol, he went to one of these gun crewmen and swapped out his M1 for a Thompson and took it on the night patrol. And he just kind of got this conspiratorial look on his face, and he said, "I never bothered to give it back." And so, when I was a soldier, it was a really, really big deal. You signed for weapons, and if you lost one of those things, they'd just cut your hands off or hang you or whatever. But apparently back then, you just mixed and matched as needed. But that's how he got his Thompson, and that would have probably been October, November of 1944, and he carried it through the end of the war. When I asked him details about the weapon, he said the actuator was on the side. So that put it as either an M1 or more probably an M1A1 Thompson. And depending upon how deep in the weeds you want to get, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he got the Thompson, and he got 5 20-round magazines and no web gear. And so he used that in combat for the rest of the war. And he carried a 1911 pistol, but he kept his 4 magazines in the pockets of his field jacket, along with a bunch of loose 45 ACP rounds. And he said whenever he had a free moment in combat, he would drop down behind a tree and shove rounds in the magazines.
Wow.
And I asked him, that seemed a little thin. He's got 100 rounds in a submachine gun. And he said he really never ran out of ammo, that apparently his engagements were usually intense and frenetic and brief. But he said he never really worried that he was going to run out of ammo in combat because he kept all these loose rounds. And he raved about the fact that his handgun and his submachine gun used the same ammo. So if things went totally sideways, he had his 1911.
Huh.
But he related a couple of combat stories. I've written about them before, but at one point, this scene was kind of reminiscent of a scene that was in Kelly's Heroes. He was traveling through a French village in the back of a half-track and engaging German infantry as they bore. And he said a guy jumped out from behind some bushes or something, and he shot him with his Thompson and dropped him, but wasn't sure if he'd actually killed him or not. And the battle went back and forth. Eventually, they seized the town and turned around and came back. And he did find the man's corpse where he'd killed him. And he said it was just a burst from the Thompson to his chest was to be darkly pragmatic, very effective. The most compelling story that he gave me, though, was right at the end of the war. And he said they had a new lieutenant who wanted to get him some combat time before the war ended. And there was a scene kind of like this in Band of Brothers. But this was obviously real. I forget the river, but the Germans were on one side of the river and the Americans were on the other. And he had a friend named Saul, short for Solomon. They were just thick as thieves. And by then, as I said, these two guys were sort of the old hands in this infantry unit. And so it was a night patrol, went across this river in little dinghies. And their mission was to snatch a couple of prisoners, and said nobody wanted to go. Everybody knew it was a waste of time. They were just trying to get this lieutenant some combat time. All they wanted to do was call it a day and go home and sit out the next 2 weeks, let the war be over.
Right.
And they pushed into a little town. They found a couple of young prisoners and took them in relatively short order. And the lieutenant wanted to go down this road and sort of do a quick recon, and they really didn't want to do that. But Saul and this gentleman were at the edge of this building, and there was a crossroads. And he said he just didn't feel good about it, and he said enough is enough. We accomplished our mission. We got these two prisoners, and regardless of what the lieutenant wants, we're leaving. So he said, we're turning around, and he went to grab his buddy Saul, and he said for reasons he never understood, and he got teary-eyed telling me about this. He said that Saul peeked around the edge of the building just to see what was over there. And when he did, there was a German soldier around the corner with an MP40 who just stitched him through the chest. Mm. And they all pulled back to include Saul, who was ambulatory. And they dropped into a nearby doorway and said his buddy was just shocked more than anything, and said he lasted about a minute and leaned against the wall and slid to the ground and bled out. It said as they came out, he came around the corner with his Thompson and killed the German who had the MP40. But at that point, they took off through what it was apparently an apartment block or something similar. They came out the back, and the Germans had booby-trapped the backyard, and they had the two German POWs, the two captured German soldiers in the lead, and they hit a tripwire, and the equivalent of an IED went off, and it killed both of the German prisoners anyway. And so they eventually got back across the river without their prisoners, and Saul had been KIA. But it obviously would just, this was more than half a century later, and he had a hard time relating that story. Saul was from New York City, and this gentleman's from Mississippi. And after the war, he went up to New York and spent some time with Saul's family and explained all the details and how much he respected and admired the man. But as you can imagine, I'm sitting in room 3 at the clinic in a busy day surrounded by screaming children and venereal disease and similar stuff. And I was riveted, just mesmerized to stories like this. Wow. And he was just an archetype. He was so typical of the greatest generation. A deacon in his church, just a wonderful, wonderful man of character with a magnificent family. And all they wanted to do after the war was come back and just build things and make the world a better place. But that was his war story. And as I said, I'll go into as much detail as you want about the history of the Thompson, but that's what I wanted to share with you.
Yeah. So, one of the kicks against the Thompson, it's heavy, and it is a stout piece of equipment. But, when you compare that to the M1 Garand, obviously it's not that big a deal, but obviously he liked the Thompson. That was his choice, even after he'd been in a couple of engagements with it, right?
Yeah. The gun weighed 10.8 pounds empty, and an M1's 9 and change, if I remember correctly. I think they just made them tougher then than we are now. The M16A1 that I carried is about 6.5 pounds, and I whined and belly ached about that too. But yeah, everything about the Thompson is wrong. The gun is too heavy. The center of gravity is too far to the rear. The fact that the pistol grip and the stock are below the line of recoil, it takes a little talent to keep it from to control muzzle rise. But those big thumb size 45 ACP rounds at in an M1A1 850 rounds per minute, that it's just devastating. And that's what made it worthwhile for him to hump that thing all the way across Europe. And that exchange with his buddy Saul, he said he just peeked around the corner and squeezed a burst off and just put that guy down. Wow. He admired the Thompson because of its downrange effects, to be darkly pragmatic, and that made it worthwhile to carry.
So I don't know how much you discussed this, but did he find it lacking? And because when I picture a infantry battle, you picture guys lying on the ground with an M1, trading rounds over 100 or 200 or 300 meters. Obviously, he was using it for its intended purpose of close-in CQB urban type of combat. Did he ever really talk about that? All the war stories he ever told me were in built-up areas at very close range. And the gentleman I mentioned earlier in Italy had some long-range engagements. And the way he described them, he said that
he respected the carbine and the Garand, but he said you might have to hit a man 2 or 3 times with a carbine to stop him. But he said if you could connect with a German soldier in something meaty with an M1 rifle at any range, he was done. And but in this particular case, this gentleman, all the stories that he told me were all very up close and personal.
Now, thinking kind of the whole package here, did he say where he got all the 45 rounds? Apparently, they didn't keep too close tabs on that either.
The logistics of that era would have been just hellish. I think they had 3 different calibers and 5 different formats. So, 7.62 by 63, 30-06 would have been in Garand clips and then in belts for 1919. Carbine rounds would have to, obviously, they were issued on strippers. But 45 ACP would have been readily available, if nothing else, to feed their handguns. And my understanding, obviously wasn't there, but my understanding is that ammo flowed very, very freely. And so, there certainly is no accountability. There's no accountability for weapons. So you could find whatever you needed. And, we didn't win the war because of Mustangs and BARs and tanks. We won the war because of Deuce-and-a-half trucks and the Red Ball Express. And that's what the U.S. Army has always been magnificent at, is logistics. And, we have just nowadays, my favorite example is an MRE. For the first time in military history, an American soldier can have a hot meal 3 meals a day. And that it seems like a small thing, but as a guy who served in the Arctic, man, it's huge when you can have breakfast, lunch, and supper that's hot 3 meals a day. And that's just American technology at work.
Yeah.
But he never said that he had any trouble finding 45 rounds.
Interesting. I don't suppose he said what happened to the gun, because I know a lot of guys might have accidentally left them in their sea bag when they were headed back home.
He didn't. And, those guys, with few exceptions, they viewed those old guns as tools. And so, when they were done, they were done. My wife's grandfather was just a hero of mine. He's the guy who fought all the way up Italy. And he came back with an MP40 and a tiny little Beretta pistol and a Walther P38. I think you and I may have discussed this before.
Right.
But the P38 he sold, the MP40 was stolen. But my prize, just what I think, once again, we've discussed it before, they'll pry it out of my cold, dead hands. My most prized possession is the Sweetheart grip on the side of his 1911.
Yeah.
And he told me at the time that they wanted the pistol back. So he took the grip off and gave the gun back to his armorer and brought the grip back. And I've since procured a beautiful 1943 Colt to put it on. But at the same time, most of the guys that I've spoken to who were there, the guns were just background clutter. And, they would bring home some German weapon or some threat weapons sometimes just as mementos. And, stuff like a Luger, guys would just go to great lengths. The Luger pistol was the alpha souvenir. But for the most part, they certainly didn't appreciate the historical significance of those things the way we do now.
Well, I'm sure a lot of guys were like, I want to get as far away from this as I possibly can. Yeah. So I can understand.
And if nothing else, I have heard a variety of stories, anecdotes of guys who would get really excited about bringing something like a Luger or P38 back, but then they get home and the luster's just gone. At that point, they if they could hawk it for $10 or $15 for money for diapers or rent, then that's where all these old guns came from. And, they just want to get on with their lives and put it behind them. So a lot of them got rid of them in the 5 or 10 years after the war.
Yep. Well, stepping back to the Thompson, I'm almost afraid to do this, but Will, in your inimitable gun geek way, let's talk about where the Thompson came from. There's a lot of mystique behind it. In my life, I've fired a number of them. I've known folks that have owned them. And I live in Indiana, and this was John Dillinger's hangout. And that's pretty laughable that every little town has a house where John Dillinger hid out and he ate at the Greasy Spoon. And there's, a wall that has bullet holes where him and the mob were practicing, which 98% of that, of course, is drummed up by the tourism board. But I have seen some authentic Dillinger Thompsons, the Crown Point jail that he broke out of, and some of that. But anyway, that's kind of my frame of reference with the Thompson, is the whole gangster era of the 1930s. But it starts before that, about what, 1910, 11, somewhere through there?
Well, once again, we'll get as deep in the weeds as you want. The story actually starts in 1860. And John Thompson was born 3 or 4 months before the beginning of the Civil War. He in and of himself was an extraordinary personality, and the Thompson was a tiny piece of the overall John Thompson story. His middle name was Taliaferro or Tolliver. I don't know how to pronounce it, but John T. Thompson. But he attended the military academy at West Point and went on active duty immediately thereafter. And at the time, he was the youngest full colonel in the Army. He was an ordnance officer. He was the youngest 06 in the Army, and was responsible for some amazing things. He sourced 15 Gatling guns and all the support gear and got it to Teddy Roosevelt for use during the assault at San Juan Hill. But he was personally responsible for the Gatling guns used during the Spanish-American War. He headed the committee that developed and adopted the 03 Springfield. He headed the committee that adopted the 1911 pistol. The Thompson-Lagarde project, Thompson-Lagarde, I don't know what they would have referred to it in the ordnance world, but that was the mob that adopted the 45 ACP as a service cartridge. But John Thompson was the mover and shaker behind all that. And JTT, his initials are acceptance marks on the sides of a lot of period handguns and rifles back then. But eventually, he was so successful that he had a little bit of notoriety. People outside the military kind of recognized his name. And so, if I remember correctly, I'm probably going to muck the details up. He left active duty and then came back on active duty for World War I. And then by the time he actually ETS for real, eventually he was brigadier general. But at that point, he got involved in the commercial undertaking that eventually resulted in the Thompson Submachine Gun. And that started with a serendipitous meeting with John Bell Blish, who was an American naval officer in 1915. And Blish was the name behind the Blish lock, or the Blish concept, which from an engineering perspective postulated that two dissimilar metals, when pushed together under pressure, the coefficient of sliding friction would change. And I've since heard intimated that that's been debunked. But that was the spark that eventually led Thompson to develop the Thompson submachine gun. And so the Blish lock was an integral part of the 1921-1928. So he formed a company, and they started, the guys who developed the Thompson, Theodore Eichhoff, George Gall, Oscar Payne, I think that was their names. Payne developed the drum and box magazines, but Thompson really sort of was the administrator. But those three guys were the ones who did the scut work, and they developed the gun. It was originally going to be marketed as the Annihilator, which is sort of perhaps flashier than it needed to be. They eventually they made an intentional decision to bend the name Annihilator and start calling it the Thompson Submachine Gun to play off of John Thompson's notoriety. But the original prototype was available about 2 days after the armistice that ended World War I. And so the intent from the beginning was to develop the ideal trench broom, a gun that was a handheld machine gun that could be used to clear trenches in Europe, but the gun was not available at the end of the war. And so at that point, it had this magnificent gun and nobody to sell it to. The original 1921s were made in a single lot of 15,000. They were contract because the auto ordnance that came up with the Thompson was sort of like Armalite. They were a think tank. They were an engineering firm, but they didn't have any manufacturing capability. So once they got all the technical drawings, the prototypes, and everything put together, they contracted it out to Colt. And Colt's Manufacturing made 15,000 of these guns in the course of 11 months in 1921. And that one lot of 15,000 guns is what lasted all the way up until World War II. So all the Thompsons that were sold after that, the ones that were used by the Dillinger and his mob, the motorized bandits, the ones that ended up in the hands of the IRA, that were used all over the world, they were made in that single 11-month run in 1921. But the guns were very expensive. At the time, the purchase price for a 1921A was $175. A 1921AC is the same gun with the cuts compensator. It was $200. And that works out to about $3,500 today. And, these are the years approaching the Great Depression, and then the gangster era was immediately following, and nobody had any money who actually worked for a living. And so the company flirted with bankruptcy on several occasions. But the original 1921 is very heavy. It would accept it came with a single 20-round magazine, would accept a 50 or 100-round drum. They're absolutely beautiful guns made to that interwar standard by Colt. The buttstocks were contracted to Remington, and but in 1928, the biggest complaint about the 1921 is it shot really fast. It cycled nearly 900 rounds a minute. So Auto Ordnance developed kind of a drop-in kit. It was an actuator, buffer, and buffer pilot that you could swap out to the 1921s that would slow the rate of fire down to about 700, 750 rounds a minute. And so they redesignated that gun the 1928. It's exactly the same weapon, but they overstamped the one with an 8 on the side. So those are called 1928 overstamps in the collector's world. And so Thompson didn't live to see his gun be successful. I forget when he died, but he died before World War II kicked off. The Army had adopted it as the 1928 A1 in 1938, and the British bought a whole pile of them because that was the only show in town. There just were no other submachine guns available. So despite the fact that it was ludicrously heavy, ridiculously expensive, it was obsolete by World War II just across the board. That was the only thing available. So they bought thousands of them. As I understand, some of them were lost in transit to U-boats. But that's the reason the Thompson was so prevalent at the beginning of the war, is because the grease gun was designed in 1942, but that was just all that was available. So the 1928 would still take drums. That was used at the beginning of the war. And then in 1942, there was an effort to redesign the whole gun to make it a little cheaper to manufacture. And so that led to the M1, which had a floating firing pin, and eventually the M1A1. And the easiest way to tell the difference between the two guns is the actuator. The 1921, 1928, the actuator's on the top. On the M1 and M1A1 is on the side. But the later M1A1 Thompsons had a smooth barrel. They did away with the fin barrel. Doesn't have a cuts compensator, and the buttstock is fixed. And the receiver is not cut to accept a drum. And so the later M1s, M1A1s would only take stick mags, 20 or 30 round stick magazines. So there's lots more Thompson stuff we can talk about, but that's one over the world as to when John Thompson was born all the way through when it was used through World War II. And, the Thompson was limited issue through Korea, and there were a bunch of them in Vietnam.
Really? Didn't know that.
I've spoken to a lot of Vietnam veterans who encountered Thompsons over there. And the reason they were so popular is kind of a curious thing we can talk about. They, as I said, the gun was obsolete by the beginning of World War II, but it just had this sex appeal. It's exactly like you're describing about how every place, every greasy spoon claims Dillinger ate there. Well, Dillinger's a repugnant personality. Everything about him was horrible. He's a psychopath. But historically speaking, we've come to think he's kind of sexy cool and sanitize some of the gory stuff about how he machine gunned innocent people sometimes. But because those guys who served in World War II, they cut their teeth on Saturday afternoon movie serials in the 1930s. Most of the cohort that served in World War II was born in the early 1920s. And so coming out of the Great Depression, one of the few pastimes that people could still afford was to go to the local theater on Saturday afternoons and see Public Enemy and and James Cagney running around with a Tommy gun. And so when they ended up in combat, it was naturally appealing to get the sexy cool Thompson and carry it and for real. And that carried all the way through to Vietnam. I've spoken to some air crews who had Thompsons. They all M1s, M1A1s from the guys I've spoken to. They sometimes would take the stocks off, but it was the kind of thing, despite the fact that it was heavy and very difficult to run without a buttstock, it would tuck in a tight little spot in a helicopter.
Right.
But special forces guys had access to them. But we gave thousands of them to the ARVNs, to the South Vietnamese, and that's what made them available. But they remained popular through Vietnam, despite the fact that they were just boat anchor heavy and inefficient. But they hit like a freight train downrange.
Yep. Well, in the time we have left, what is it that intrigues Will Dabbs about the Thompson? Because I know you have a deep and abiding love for them in spite of their shortcomings. What is it that draws you to it? The history, the engineering, or what?
I fall for the same things that those guys did back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It just, the appeal to the historical guns in general to me are just, you can touch history. And I actually saved up for a long, long time and bought myself an original 1921 Thompson a year or so ago. And my particular gun is stamped on the side Seattle Police, and I found out all the details about when it was shipped from Auto Ordnance to what hardware store in Seattle, and how it was in a lot of 5 that was sold to the Seattle Police Department. Was used operationally all the way through the 1990s, early 2000s, and then was amazingly, as left-wing as the Seattle government is, they actually sold their Thompsons on the private market. And that never would happen today, obviously. But it went to a guy who fired a single drum magazine through it and then put it in his box, and then it came to me. So I'm the third owner of this thing. And it's kind of, relatively speaking, there are lots prettier guns out there. This one's kind of beat up because it rode around in a squad car for half a century. And you know what it's like, for cops and soldiers, guns are tools, and you're not going to venerate them and love on them and such. They're just utility items. But to answer your question, I cherish that thing because of where it's been and what it's done. It was in that first run of 15,000 Thompsons that rolled off the lines in 11 months in 1921. And you can touch that thing and come closer to experiencing those remarkable eras in history than you can from reading about it or watching movies. And so I am ape over a Thompson for the same reason. I just like all those old World War II artifacts and things. It's a tangible connection to some remarkable times.
Well, imagine, if you would, a perfect world where you could go to the hardware store and buy a machine gun. What a great country we used to have.
Honestly.
Well, great historical perspective, both from World War II and on the gun itself. And I knew you'd be the guy to share all that. So, Will, we really appreciate your thoughts and honoring those the greatest generation that they really were. So, folks can always see you in Guns Magazine, American Handgunner, and unfortunately, you write for a bunch of those other magazines. But we really enjoy having you. Pays the bills and keeps you out of the bars. I know you have a tremendous ammunition budget, so I understand you got to keep the guns happy and well fed. So anyway, we'll really appreciate it, and we will talk again in the future, I'm sure.
Oh, what a delightful morning! I get to talk about machine guns with my friend, brother, and boss Brent Wheat. It's been a treat for me, man.
It's always great talking to Will Dabbs and hearing his stories, and honestly, when I grow up, I hope someday I'll know as much as he does. Well, before we go, I've got to remind you, please check out our great sponsors. First and foremost is 4patriots.com. For all of your preparedness supplies and needs, check out 4patriots.com, and if you use the code GUNMAG at checkout, you get 10% off your first order. That's a great deal if you go to 4patriots.com and use the code GUNMAG. Also, if you're into precision shooting, precision riflery, long-range hunting, check out Creedmoorsports.com. They've got everything and more that you need for those various disciplines. So check out Creedmoorsports.com. Well, that's it for this episode of the Guns Magazine podcast. Again, on behalf of everybody from FMG Publications, I'm Guns Magazine editor Brent Wheat, reminding you, now get out there and get shooting.